The division of centers. It is necessary to illustrate the division of other centers so we have some general chart to use and navigate, and to which we can refer some of our personal observations of ourselves, then find where they belong. For this helps to see oneself more clearly. We'll first have to divide certain centers into positive and negative divisions, then fill in here and there. At present only some of the subdivisions provide approximate definitions of their functions. Let's begin therefore with the intellectual center. Here only the moving part of intellectual center is in any detail charted in the diagram. Note the difference between emotional segment of moving part of intellectual center, and the emotional part of intellectual center as a whole. Observe the difference between them. In these diagrams of the centers and their divisions, only a few parts are charted, serving as a guide only to the observation of centers and their work. All that has been given so far requires careful study because we are all individuals, and therefore unique. First, it is necessary to register what is said about the centers and parts as given. Then to think about what it all means, to build an individual profile of the subject, for this puts it in higher parts of centers. Lastly, to find examples, and try to place them. It is important at this stage not to question the parts of centers not mapped, as this represents always a sign of negative thinking, and automatic questioning, which is worse than formatory questioning. To ask about Asia when a commentary is given on America, or to ask about the exception when a rule is being explained. We can discuss now the negative divisions of centers, and what they mean. In order to do so, let's speak of the intellectual center, which is divided naturally into a positive side, and a negative side. At the same time examine a little of what thinking is, and what the work means with regard to arranging the intellectual center in its right order. What is the function of the negative part of intellectual center? Roughly, its function is to think no, to negate. The function of the positive part of the intellectual center is to think yes, to affirm. Thus the whole center can be represented in this way. Without a negative part in the intellectual center, it would be impossible to think. What is thinking? The first definition this system offers is that thinking is comparing. Thinking is comparing one thing with another, one proposition with another, and so on. But if an individual only has affirmation or yes as an instrument to think with, comparison will not be possible. Comparison requires a quality decision, or a choice between two things, one to which one says yes, and the other no. All the questions we ask beginning with why, as distinct from those beginning with how mean that we seek a reason for something. And all reasoning involves comparison or choice, that is, selecting this, and rejecting that. And it would be impossible to select or reject unless there were in the intellectual center a dual power. Namely, the power of affirmation, and the power of negation. The two parts of the center should be able to work together, somewhat in the same way as the two blades of a pair of scissors function, one acting against the other. That is, a person should be able to see what affirms, as well as what negates, whatever they are thinking about. Then hold them together, and between the two opposite sides find a path for their thoughts. For all genuine thinking leads in some direction for the mind, and should lead to a new place in the mind, not always along old neural pathways, to the same places where one has been before. That are really reached without any thinking and simply through habitual association. Speaking here of genuine thinking, which requires effort and is something people rarely do. Everyone engaged in this work is advised to move their brains once every day, and this means making real effort to think. What we ordinarily call thinking is merely an automatic flow of associations, a flight of vague ideas and memories, phrases interrupted by an occasional slight effort to recollect something, such as what we have to buy, where we left our keys, or where we have to go today. When the intellectual center is working as a whole, all of its different parts and divisions, all the subdivisions fall into their right order and functions, but this rarely happens. The whole center is rarely lit up. As a rule, only small parts and subdivisions work, that is, they work at minimum load, with only a little light, and in small parts, so cannot deal with any thoughts or ideas which need the activity of the center as a whole. Again, people as a rule do not know what to think about. This system, with all of its ideas and principles, its background and its practical detail, the entire teaching is a connected, organic ecosystem, constructed to make an individual think, and to teach them how to think. Then to give them something through which to develop their own individual thinking. While some of the ideas are easy to grasp and on a small scale, others are more difficult and on a larger scale. So the connection between them may not be seen for a long time, but the whole of the intellectual center, with all of its parts, small and great, are eventually required to hold the system together in its right order, so that it can function correctly, transmitting force as an organized and a living whole. This is not a question of memory only, for memory is first of all a function of the mechanical or formatory division of the intellectual center, which registers, and this part is not enough to comprehend the ideas of the teaching fully. It is also a question of evaluation, of seeing and tasting its truth. At the same time, unless this system is registered properly in us, it cannot develop and grow rightly, to receive and transmit the vibrations of higher centers. It is therefore important to understand that there is no force in the work itself taken as words and diagrams, but in what the work transmits through being understood of free will. Through practice, applied to function and action in our daily lives. For when the work is understood, then it has formed something in us that we did not possess before, and this instrument can respond to influences of which we were not formerly conscious. It is these influences that modify, change, and eventually transform us as individuals. We should therefore grasp how important it is to keep the work alive in ourselves, to hear its ideas over and over again, then ponder them, reflect and again try to act and to live this work. For if the work dies in a person, through the overwhelming pressure of life and its daily demands, it may be difficult to awaken it again. People easily fall asleep. And it takes a great deal of time, study, effort and sacrifice before the work forms itself strongly enough in a person to remain alive of itself. So people must stay in touch with those who can keep it alive with them, and whose task it is to do so. This is an attempt to illustrate how the intellectual center, working as a whole, is necessary for the full comprehension of this system. And how the system is constructed for this purpose, how it can organize the whole of the intellectual center correctly, into an instrument of change that can begin to respond to the influences coming from higher centers. However, as this subject belongs to relative thinking, which alone brings the intellectual center into right action, we can for the moment return to the divisions of the center into its positive and negative sides. Then consider them with regard to the wrong working of centers, and parts of centers. Let's look then at negative thinking. Negative thinking occurs when a person thinks only, or mainly, from the negative side of the intellectual center. They use the negative part to think, which can lead only to negativity. As mentioned, the two sides, positive and negative, should work together and check one another. If a person starts to think, let's say, of this work from the negative side of the intellectual center, and allows this side to continue its activity unchecked, then they are bound to reach a denial of the work, because the negative side can only join things together in the form of increasing negation. The end result will therefore be, no. This negative thinking, about matters such as the work, is very common today. But in order for us to flourish, it must discard, reject, or disparage anything which does not agree with it. Negative thinking takes many forms in different people. Some people have well-developed systems of entirely unchecked negative thinking about different things. About themselves, about others, about life, about the world, the universe, and so on. These systems have formed independently of the positive side of the intellectual center, and are therefore one-sided, unchecked, unchallenged by any opposite thinking, and often a source of mental illness. One of the easiest things to do is to disagree. To habitually dispute is to use the negative part of the center. Habitual disagreeing, finding fault, picking holes and splitting hairs is to use the negative side unchecked. And a negative thinker is, in brief, an individual to avoid, for whatever you say to them, they will try to destroy it. They cannot help doing so, for they are, so to speak, intellectually in reverse gear, and can only go backwards. All this is wrong use of a center. On the other hand, a person who thinks only on the side of affirmation, a yes man or one who habitually agrees with everything, will never grasp it either. It can never become real to them, for they will not have passed through any temptation with regard to the work and struggled or worked things out for themselves, by slow degree. There is a story in the work that once upon a time man was perfect. Man was in touch with higher centers. In fact, it is said he conversed with the gods. But he was very weak, because never having denied and always having affirmed, he did not know how to meet with denial, so he fell easily from this high position, for he had no strength of intellect and understanding from himself. Today, he has to find his way back to where he once was, with the power of denial to help him. There are some interesting things that can be said with regard to the two divisions, positive and negative, of the intellectual center. If we take them in conjunction with other centers, such as emotional center, then a person may have negative thinking and positive feeling or will towards something. Alternately, they may have positive thinking and negative feeling or will. In order to illustrate this, the example given in the Gospels is useful to consider. A man had 2 sons, and he came to the first and said, "Son, go work today in the vineyard." And he answered and said, "I will not." But afterward, he repented himself and went. And he came to the second and said likewise. And he answered and said, "I go, sir." And went not. Whether of the twain did the will of his father? Matthew, chapter 21, verses 28 to 31. A person who has a very mechanical affirmation from the intellectual center will say yes to everything, but that belongs to their thought, not to their will. The basis of will lies in the emotional center. So we say yes with our thinking, but eventually no with the emotional center. Or a person has negative thoughts and positive feelings. They say no with their mind, but their feelings say yes later on. The parable or psychological definition can be understood differently. But it means that a person is not one, and has 2 distinct sides which do not necessarily agree. Another observation to be shared is that if a person has no magnetic center, which affirms the existence of 2 kinds of influences in the vortex of life, namely A and B, they may start only from the negative side of thinking once they meet work of this kind. And so spend all of their time in disproving. A feeling starts a certain kind of thinking. Our intellectual apparatus, as it is divided into positive and negative, can give any result according to whether one side or the other is set into action. It can prove or disprove anything. It is valuation, the emotional center, that is decisive. Regarded as a pure machine, the 2 sides of the intellectual center are mutually destructive. This is why it is said that a third factor is necessary for the proper working of the center, or third force.